This is the first of a two-part lecture series on the Battle of Nomonhan and the antecedents of World War II. This lecture is about a battle fought along an ill-defined border in Northeast Asia in the summer of 1939 between the Soviet Red Army and their client state, the Mongolian People's Republic, and the Imperial Japanese Army. The results of this battle contributed to a strategic reassessment by Imperial Japanese High Command about where to gain the economic and territorial expansion they sought leading up to the outbreak of World War II in 1941. In preparing this lecture, I borrowed heavily and primarily from this book, Nomonhan, 1939, The Red Army's Victory That Shaped World War II by Dr. Stuart Goldman. The events described in this book provided me with my first glimpse into and understanding of the significance of this obscure and little-known battle on the Mongolian Steppe in the summer of 1939 that was consequential for World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. I have had the pleasure of meeting and getting to know Dr. Goldman, who helped me arrange a tour of the Nomonhan battlefield in Mongolia. No cogent study of the antecedents of World War II would be complete without an understanding of this battle. 1853 was an important year for the history of both Japan and Russia. In that year, American Commodore Matthew Perry's squadron of black ships sailed into Tokyo Bay, ushering in an urgency by Japan to modernize its society and, not the least, its military. Also in 1853, Russia invaded Turkish-controlled Danubian territories, igniting the Crimean War. The war escalated to involve France and England, who were eventually victorious. Russia was humiliated, being defeated on its own soil. This too spurred modernization within Tsarist Russia. Because of the resulting diplomatic isolation in Europe, the Tsarist government redirected its attention toward Asia in order to assert its great power status. Within the Japanese High Command, two diametrically opposed strategic options developed, each aimed at ensuring Japan's dominance of the Far East. This debate began early in the 20th century. A February 1907 Imperial National Defense Guideline envisioned two strategies. The strike north option is summarized by a defensive posture in the south and an advance in the north. The opposing plan was the strike south option is summarized by a defensive posture in the north and an advance in the south. The strike north option was a pre-World War II Japanese political doctrine which stated that Manchuria and Siberia were in Japan's sphere of interest and that the potential value to Japan for economic and territorial expansion in those areas was greater than elsewhere. It enjoyed wide support within the Imperial Japanese Army. The principal deterrent to this direction of expansion was Tsarist and later Soviet Russia. The strike south option was a political doctrine which stated that Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands were Japan's sphere of interest and that the potential value to the Japanese Empire for economic expansion in those areas was greater than elsewhere. Its principal goal was to seize the resources in Southeast Asia and neutralize the threat posed by Western military forces in the Pacific. Because of geography, its chief advocate was the Imperial Japanese Navy. The principal deterrent to this plan was the United States Navy. Each option carried risks. The strike north option carried the risk of a ground war with the Soviet Union. The strike south option carried the risk of a war with the United States Navy and its amphibious component, the United States Marine Corps. Inevitably, Russian and Japanese interests collided over influence and control over Korea and Northeast Asia. Japan first sought to negotiate with the Russians over Manchuria and Korea. The Russians demanded all of Manchuria as a Russian sphere of influence and northern Korea as a buffer zone. Russia threw Japan a bone by offering southern Korea as a Japanese sphere of influence. This was wholly unacceptable to Tokyo, and it was clear that the Russians were using the negotiations only to buy time to build up its military in the region via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Tokyo saw through Russian duplicity and decided in 1904 that the only way to resolve the difference was to go to war with Russia, and the sooner the better. And so, in 1904, the war came, again without warning and without a declaration of war. Starting wars without a declaration would become a Japanese modus operandi. This map represents the status quo antebellum in 1904. Russia occupied nearly all of Manchuria, including the important Liaotung Peninsula and Port Arthur. As it had in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur without warning. The Japanese laid siege to the Russian Far East Fleet bottled up in Port Arthur. The Imperial Japanese Army moved up the Korean peninsula and landed troops on the Liaotung Peninsula. Port Arthur eventually fell to the Japanese after a long and bloody battle. The two Japanese forces converged on Mukden, where the final battle was fought with a Russian defeat and with heavy casualties on both sides. Russia sought to reinforce its Far East Fleet by sending its Baltic Fleet halfway around the world, a deployment that took 7 months. The British denied the Baltic Fleet passage through the Suez Canal, adding months to the journey. The Japanese engaged the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait on May 27 and 28, 1905. The Russian fleet was virtually annihilated, losing 8 battleships sunk and more than 5,000 men lost. The Russians had had enough and sued for peace. The Battle of Tsushima was Navy history's only decisive sea battle fought by modern steel battleship fleets and the first naval battle in which radio played a critically important role. It has been characterized as the dying echo of an old era. For the last time in the history of naval warfare, ships of the line or battleships of a beaten fleet surrendered on the high seas. With the military successes at Port Arthur, Mukden, and Tsushima, Japan now sought an end to the war and a negotiated peace. She invoked the aid of President Theodore Roosevelt in getting the belligerents to the negotiating table. Out of these negotiations, the war was ended with Japan in substantial control of what she set out to get. According to the articles in the treaty, Russia acknowledged Japan's unlimited freedom of action in Korea and agreed to withdraw her troops from Manchuria and setting the new frontier at the Amur and Ussuri rivers. Russia's biggest loss was the Liaotung Peninsula and the warm water port at Port Arthur she so desperately desired. Russia also relinquished control of the South Manchurian Railway and its spur down the length of Korea. According to the articles of the Treaty of Portsmouth, both Russia and Japan had to pull out of Manchuria proper. Japan withdrew to the Liaotung Peninsula, now known as the Kwantung Leased Territory, and in 1905 set up the Kwantung Government Administration. In 1906, the Kwantung Army was created from the troops who had been occupying South Manchuria. Its main objective was to control and protect the South Manchurian Railway, a future route into Manchuria, and it was hoped, into eastern Siberia, all the way to Lake Baikal. 2 years after the war, Japan and Russia concluded a secret treaty. Russia recognized Korea as a sphere of Japanese influence, and Japan recognized Outer Mongolia as a Russian sphere of influence. Manchuria is equally divided between Japan and Russia, with the Imperial Japanese Army firmly entrenched in the Kwantung Leased Territory of the Liaotung Peninsula. At the same time, China seemed to disintegrate into civil war. Following the bloodletting of the First World War, nearly all of Japan's traditional rivals, with the notable exception of the United States, had been seriously weakened, paralyzed, or liquidated. After the Russian Revolution and the Civil War that followed, the Russian army was less of a threat to Japan. As a way to fight the perceived threat of communism that had taken hold in Russia a few years earlier, the Allies sought to intervene on the side of the White Russians. The Allied intervention was a multinational military expedition launched during the Russian Civil War in 1918, also known as the Siberian Intervention. The initial goals of the Siberian intervention were to help the Czechoslovak Legion secure supplies of munitions and armaments in Russian ports and to re-establish the Eastern Front against the Germans. The Czechoslovak Legion was trapped along the Trans-Siberian Railway. To effect this rescue, several Allied forces were sent to Vladivostok, including 13,000 Americans on the orders of President Wilson. Japan, initially asked to contribute 7,000 troops, eventually sent 70,000. This large Japanese force made the Allies, especially the Americans, wary of the real Japanese motivation. Even though one goal of the intervention was to re-establish the Eastern Front, the Japanese never intended to proceed any further west than Lake Baikal. Their real motive was to set up a buffer state in eastern Siberia to put as much territory between them and communist Russia. The Americans, suspicious of Japanese intentions, stayed behind to keep an eye on the Japanese. In the end, the Japanese were unsuccessful in creating a separate state in eastern Siberia, and the Red Army won the Civil War, and the Soviet Union was born. The Americans were evacuated in 1920, but the Japanese remained behind until 1922, until they too were evacuated. The Japanese suffered 5,000 casualties, and 129 American graves were left in the wastelands of Siberia. By the 1920s, the Imperial Japanese Army had undergone a dramatic change. Junior officers began to usurp increasing control over Army policy, especially within the Kwantung Army on the Liaotung Peninsula in the Kwantung Lease territory. A peculiar Japanese aberration began to assert itself within the Kwantung Army called Gekko Chugo, which literally means rule from below. In practice, it meant insubordination to higher authority and command. Many of the Kwantung Army senior leaders overtly advocated political change in Japan through the violent overthrow of the civilian government and reorganization along totalitarian state fascist lines. It advocated a more aggressive, expansionist foreign policy regarding the Asian mainland, especially in China and Manchuria. After defeating the Russians in 1905, the Kwantung Army was established to defend the Kwantung Lease territory, especially the South Manchurian Railway Zone. Its headquarters was located at Port Arthur. Although the Kwantung Army was nominally subordinate to the Imperial General Headquarters and the senior officers at the Army General Staff, its leadership often acted in direct violation of the orders from Tokyo without suffering any consequences. Without consulting Tokyo, it carried out the assassination of Manchurian warlords in 1928. Japan lacked many of the natural resources needed to fight a continental war. These, among others, included iron ore, coal, food staples, and timber. Japan had to import many of these natural resources. In any future war, these resources might be cut off. These resources were in abundance in Manchuria. As far as the Kwantung Army was concerned, Manchuria would serve not only as a buffer against the Soviet Union, but also a source of natural resources to wage war. Manchuria was ripe for the picking. From its toehold on the continent in the Kwantung Lease territory and the port facilities of Port Arthur, the South Manchurian Railway, which the Imperial Japanese Army controlled, the way was open to Manchuria for economic and agrarian exploitation. After Manchuria, who knew how far they could go? They had always had designs on the Trans-Baikal area of Siberian Russia. The question remained, what pretext could they use to make the move into Manchuria? On September 18, 1931, Shishiro Itakagi, the Kwantung Army's chief of intelligence, and Colonel Kanji Ishiwara carried out a carefully plotted fake attack at Mukden. They tried to blow up a railway line and then blamed it on Chinese bandits. Despite careful planning, they bungled the operation. The tracks were only slightly damaged. The trains passed harmlessly over them after the explosion. Even the Japanese engineering experts were baffled. Here they are inspecting the damage. Even though the sabotage attempt was a failure, it accomplished its intended aim. Known to the world as the Manchurian Incident, it gave Japan the necessary pretext for the well-prepared Kwantung Army to move in and occupy, within a matter of hours, all the key points across the large territory of Manchuria. Blowing up the railroad was the pretext Japan used to justify the invasion and occupation of Manchuria on September 18, 1931. Within a matter of months, Japanese troops occupied all of Manchuria and set up a puppet government called Manchukuo, nominally ruled by the deposed Manchu Emperor Henry Puyi, all under the control of the Kwantung Army. Japan's occupation of Manchuria profoundly altered its relations with the Soviet Union. To the north and east, Manchuria shared a long border with the Soviet Union. To the west lay the Mongolian People's Republic. The Japanese Empire had suddenly and violently acquired a 3,000-mile border with the Soviet Union, a border with their arch-enemy and one that would have to be defended. This border was mostly riverine, following the Amur eastward to its confluence with the Ussuri, then south to a point where the boundaries of Korea, Manchuria, and the Russian maritime provinces meet. The ongoing civil war between the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong provided Japan a unique opportunity to expand its positions further into not only Manchuria, but also into North China. But it needed a pretext for starting the war. It needed another incident, and this one exploded into the Second Sino-Japanese War. On July 7, 1937, Japan had expanded its forces in China to an estimated 7,000 to 15,000 men. By now, the Imperial Japanese Army had already moved in and surrounded Peking and Tianjin. Chinese forces opposed Japanese forces across the Marco Polo Bridge just outside Peking. Shots were exchanged after a Japanese soldier wandered off and got lost. Before long, a full-fledged battle ensued, just what the Japanese wanted. This was their pretext for launching a full-scale war against the nationalist Chinese. This became known to the world as the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the fuse that ignited World War II in the Pacific. From a strictly military point of view, however, Japan was so much better prepared than China that its armies achieved rapid initial success. Within the course of 2 years, Japan obtained possession of most of the ports, the majority of the chief cities, mostly along the coast, and as far west as Hankow, and most of the major railways. Peking and Tientsin were occupied in July 1937. After fierce fighting, the Chinese armies were driven out of the Shanghai area by the middle of November 1937. Nanking, the nationalist capital, fell in mid-December 1937. After initial Japanese conquests, Japan became bogged down and was stuck in an unwinnable war. Despite the stalemate in China, Japan never forgot about its problem on the border in Manchuria. Between 1939 and 1945, there were over 1,000 border violations and armed clashes between the Soviet Red Army and the Imperial Japanese Army. The most notable of these border incidents took place during the summer of 1939 near the little Manchurian village of Nomonhan. This battle was more than a mere border skirmish. It was a virtual undeclared war between the Soviet Union and Japan that had repercussions for the war in Europe and the looming war in the Pacific. The Battle of Nomonhan, as the Japanese referred to it, or the Battle of Hokkingal, as the Russians referred to it, involved over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes, and accounted for 30 to 50,000 casualties on both sides. The fighting at Nomonhan reached its climax in late August 1939 and coincided with the signing of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and the outbreak of war in Europe. These events are not coincidental, but dramatically linked. Nomonhan is a little village located in northwestern Manchuria near the border with Mongolia, now the Mongolian People's Republic, the second communist country after the Soviet Union. Nomonhan was located on the east side of the Halhal River, which the Japanese claimed was the border between Manchuria and Mongolia. The Soviets and the Mongolians claimed that the border was about 10 miles east of the river. The area between these two disputed borders was the site of the most consequential border clash, the one that took place in the summer of 1939. According to Imperial Japanese Army sources, while the Kuomintang Army was mopping up the last armed resistance in Manchuria, the Soviet Union began bolstering its defenses in the Far East. By the time Japanese forces turned their attention to the international boundary, the Soviets had made substantial progress in strengthening their defenses. These measures included double-tracking the Trans-Siberian Railway, constructing large-scale border fortifications, and increasing garrison units from 2 to 3 in 1932 to 20 in 1934. In response, the Japanese began a major program of border fortifications. Additionally, new railroad lines were constructed in Manchuria along military lines. Japan then planned to relocate 1 million people from Japan to Nipponize Manchuria. The Battle of Nomonhan took place on the eastern Mongolian steppe along the Halhal River. I took this photo from the hills over which the Soviet tanks and infantry attacked across the Halhal River. This Japanese officer, Major Masanobu Tsuji, was a middle-level, brash, impudent Japanese officer who played an outsized role in the battle and wrote the orders that encouraged the Japanese to move across the border and attack the Soviets and Mongolians, who frequently moved east of the rivers to what they claimed was sovereign Mongolian territory. During the night of May 10th and 11th, a 20-man Mongolian People's Republic border patrol crossed the Halhal River and moved east toward the village of Nomonhan. The next morning, they were discovered by Manchukuo forces north of the Holston River. A Manchukuo cavalry force of about 40 men drove them back over the Halhal River. Over the course of the next several days, the two sides clashed, escalating the clash each time to what started out as a mere border skirmish to become a major Soviet-Japanese confrontation. Each side blamed the other for instigating the fighting, but nearly all accounts agree that the actual fighting was initiated by the Manchukuo forces. Much of the fighting took place near this stream, the Holston River. Each side escalated the situation at the border by reinforcing its position. Each side also brought in more artillery and armor, especially the Soviets. Soviet armor included the BA-10 armored car and the BT-5 tank, each equipped with a high-velocity 45mm gun. The Japanese had no anti-tank weapon to counter Soviet armor, and it played a significant role in the ensuing battles that reached its peak in August 1939. The escalating conflict with Japan was cause for great concern in Moscow, especially as war in Europe loomed on the horizon. To bolster their position on the Manchurian-Mongolian border, the Kremlin ordered Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, an early proponent of tank warfare, to take command in the east. On arrival at the front in Mongolia, Zhukov inspected the combat zone near the Halhal River. His report to Moscow indicated that the fighting near the Halhal River did not appear to be a mere border clash. In his estimation, the Japanese were likely to escalate their aggression, and his current troop disposition did not seem adequate to stop them. Based on Zhukov's battlefield assessment, Moscow rushed infantry and armor reinforcements to the Mongolian front along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Throughout the summer of 1939, the fighting continued as each side crossed into what the other side claimed was their side of the border. Each side continued to reinforce its position, raising the ante for even greater battles with mounting casualties. The Japanese believed that the Soviets could not counterattack because they thought it was logistically impossible to move enough supplies from Moscow along the continent-long Trans-Siberian Railway and then to truck it to the battlefield at the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The nearest Japanese supply depot was only 50 miles away. The nearest Soviet line to the front line from the railhead at Borgia was over 400 miles away. Stalin had an ace up his sleeve that proved invaluable in the summer of 1939. He had a spy in Tokyo. Richard Sorga was a German Azerbaijani journalist and Soviet military intelligence officer who was active before and during World War II and worked undercover as a German journalist in both Nazi Germany and in Japan. Throughout the pre-war period, he provided valuable intelligence to Stalin about Japanese diplomatic and military intentions. Some have made the claim that he was the best spy of all time. Sorga reported to Stalin that Japan's top political and military leaders sought to prevent the escalation of the conflict at Nomonhan into an all-out war. These developments gave the cautious Stalin confidence to commit the Red Army to large-scale combat operations in eastern Mongolia. In early August, Stalin gave Zhukov the order to prepare a major offensive to clear the Nomonhan area of the Japanese who had violated Mongolian territory once and for all. The battle between the Soviet Red Army and the Japanese Imperial Army reached its climax in late August 1939. Following the massive movement of Soviet supplies east along the Trans-Siberian Railway, Zhukov was ready to launch his counteroffensive. The Kwantung Army was dug in static defensive positions north and south of the Holston River, east of the Halhal River. Zhukov's operational plan was simple. He would divide the 1st Army Group into 3 strike forces. The central force was to launch a frontal assault and tie down the main Japanese strength. At the same time, the northern and southern strike forces, with the bulk of the armor, were to turn in the Japanese flanks and force them into a pocket that then would be reduced and destroyed by the combined efforts of all 3 forces. On August 31st, Zhukov declared the disputed territory between the Halhal River and the boundary line that ran through Nomonhan clear of Japanese troops. The Japanese army had been annihilated with between 18,000 and 23,000 casualties along the border between May and September. The casualty rate for the 23rd Division was 76%. It was the worst military defeat in modern Japanese history up to that time. Zhukov was capable of pushing on well beyond Nomonhan, but was ordered by Moscow to stop at the Soviet-claimed border. The Japanese Foreign Ministry instructed their ambassador in Moscow to open negotiations with the Soviet government for a speedy settlement of the incident. He was authorized to accept the boundary claimed by the Mongolians as the basis for a temporary ceasefire. Marshal Zhukov was ordered back to Moscow, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin and the Hero of the Soviet Union medals. Here is Marshal Zhukov probably standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin after the war with 3 Hero of the Soviet Union medals. I will continue this lecture on the Battle of Nomonhan in the next lecture, Part 2.